Good morning. Welcome to Thought for the Day on Monday the 11th of April. Today's reading is Luke chapter 22, verses 1 to 23, and it is taken from the English Standard Version of the Bible. Now, the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." "Where do you want us to prepare for it?" they asked. He replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. Make preparations there." They left and found things just as Jesus had told them, so they prepared the Passover. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. And he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And he took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed, but woe to that man who betrays him." They began to question among themselves which of them it might be who would do this. It is clear from the passage in Luke that Jesus has put some forethought into the celebration of Passover with his disciples. There was obviously a pre-arrangement with the owner of the house that Peter and John were sent to find. Jesus knows the significance of the Passover within his culture, but he also knows the significance of this Passover. It will be his last meal with those he is closest to, his last chance to prepare them for what is to come. I wonder how the various participants felt in that upper room that night. I think the tension must have been palpable. Perhaps the disciples were feeling bewildered. Jesus has entered Jerusalem in triumph, the crowds in a frenzy, rolling out the red carpet in the form of cloaks and palm leaves. The disciples could be forgiven for thinking that everything was going rather well. But now the picture looks somewhat less rosy. You can almost feel the sense of danger. And Jesus is acting strangely, washing their feet, telling them this is his last meal, talking about suffering. Knowing the rest of the story, it is easier to make sense of the things Jesus said. But at the time they would have made no sense at all. I wonder how Judas felt, knowing the bargain he had made, sitting at supper with them. I wonder how Jesus felt, fearful of the ordeal that he knew was coming, worried about whether he'd done enough to make his disciples ready. Most of all, I wonder at the love and grace we see him display for Judas. Jesus knew what Judas had done, what he was about to do, and yet he is included, welcomed even, his feet washed with the others. How does it feel to sit and eat with your betrayer and lovingly give him the opportunity to take a different path? Passover is observed by Jewish people every year, a national festival that takes place in the warmth and intimacy of family homes. It is a celebration of their release from slavery in Egypt. The story begins in Exodus, when God tells Moses, "I have seen the misery of my people, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them." Passover is an opportunity for the people to look back on their history and remember their suffering and God's concern for them regarding that suffering. Remember that God came down to rescue them. All of the preceding plagues which affected Egypt did not affect the areas where the Hebrews lived, but the final plague was different. This time they were expected to participate, to engage with God and to be obedient to God's instructions in order to avoid the destruction that fell around them. The symbols and rituals of Passover remind them of that need for obedience too. At the Last Supper, Jesus deliberately ties his story to the story of Exodus. God is once again intervening to liberate his people, inviting us all to step out in faith and obedience in order to take hold of our liberation. Just as before, there is a sacrificial lamb. Only this time, it is the Son of God. Just as before, we are encouraged to remember, to remind ourselves again and again of the story that tells of God's provision for us. There is a danger that the taking of communion becomes so familiar that we do it without thinking. This Easter, as we look back to the mercy of God at the cross, as we relive the Last Supper so that we don't forget, let us pause to reflect on the immensity of the love, the immensity of the cost, the continuing story of the God who came down to rescue us, and the wondrous grace that envelops it all. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a good rest of your day.